Hello, and welcome to episode 6 of GP Red Presents. This episode 6 is the uphill road to financial stability. This episode is actually presented in 3 parts, which are featuring highlights from a webinar that was hosted by Amilia and moderated by Liz McConomy. There were 5 panelists in all 3 parts, including Chris Dropinski, Jamie Sabbach, Lisa Paradis, Janet Bartnik, and Stacie Anaya. In episode 2 today, we are looking at the how and why cost recovery is important, and it'll be featuring 3 of the panelists who are consultants in the field working on these topics for parks and recreation agencies around the country: Chris Dropinski, Jamie Sabbach, and Lisa Paradis. I'm Dr. Teresa Penbrook. Please like, subscribe, and comment to this video so that we can continue to bring you more of GP Red Presents, and most of all, I hope you enjoy.
We're going to move into another section right now. This one's much more tied to cost recovery and resource allocation. I think we've identified current state, what the challenges are, but one of the common threads through all 3 of the answers that we got was it's really important for us to be thinking about our finances and thinking about what are the essential elements that need to stay, and then how do we then go in and strip out from there and figure out how to reallocate our resources. There are many things that an agency can do to start preparing or taking the right steps towards those budget cuts or preparing for this new reality. There have been 3 common kind of themes that have emerged, and the 3 of them across the board when thinking about cost recovery or taking a really frank look at what it is that you're spending on has been resilience. So if anything happened, how could you bounce back? We're learning right now whether or not we were prepared for the bounce back protection that we need. Transparency, be honest. You've got to be real about where you're at. You've got to be real about what your struggles are. You've got to be real about what maybe you haven't been doing right, and you can right that wrong right at this moment. I just said right 8 times, apologies. And accountability. So how do you hold yourself accountable, hold your staff, your organization, everyone around you accountable for how do you hold yourselves accountable to stay true to that plan and to stay on track? So this brings me to Lisa. And Lisa, I wanted to ask you about this idea of transparency and accountability within organizations. Tell me about how the cost recovery or resource allocation works to create that transparency and accountability that we're talking about.
Yeah, so thank you. That was a great question. And I'm going to refer back to a couple of things that both Chris and Jamie said. I'm going to first start with culture, though, too, that I think is the driving force of any kind of implementation when it comes to philosophical change in any organization. Culture is a huge issue, and it's a huge factor in how you deal with change and how you can implement any kind of financial sustainability model, especially one that's founded on cost recovery. But the cost recovery process in and of itself, and I can say this both as a practitioner and then also as a consultant to other agencies who were tackling this kind of method for their financial stability, is really it's not easy. It can be made easier by having the right things in place. But as Jamie said, if you can't write the check, nothing else matters. So while it's not easy, it's crucially important to do for organizations to position themselves well in a whole host of ways. Because it's not easy, it's why it's one of the things that organizations don't tackle. It is a kick the can down the curb kind of thing where they think that either a consultant has to come in to do this kind of work, or that they don't have the tools necessary within their own organization to tackle something like this. That said, one of the reasons, or a couple of the reasons for tackling or really lifting back the veil, if anyone's ever seen that show, I think it's still on, it's called Bar Rescue, and this guy, John Taffer, goes in. Some people are, some of the panelists are nodding their heads, they know what I'm talking about. He goes in and does this thing where he says they're gonna lift back the veil of the people's accounting in their books, their bookkeeping. And of course, it's always, just an awful, nasty mess. And that's, obviously not what we're hoping for in the park and rec world, but oftentimes that's one of the reasons why organizations don't tackle any kind of financial change within their organizations, because they don't want to shine a light on some of the deficiencies that are inherent in and historically inherent in our world. Historically, we're not set up from an education standpoint and from a very philosophical, altruistic, inner core. The people that we are in the park and rec world are not necessarily the people who are business minded, and so our tendencies are toward how can we do more for less, and we'll just adapt. But we're not necessarily the people, and I'm not trying to offend anybody out there, but it hasn't been historically one of the things that has been easily taken to in the park and recreation world. Now we're seeing a lot of change in the last 5 years or so in that. But tackling a model, a cost recovery model, for instance, and implementing change in that area also creates what we talked about, what you first talked about, Liz, which was articulation. It creates resilience, and it also creates accountability. As a practitioner, what I can tell you is that doing the math, as Jamie said, doing the math, and then having all the discussions around the math, because it's more than just the math. Chris talked about the principle and the balance of principle versus enterprise, right? We know we have to charge fees, but we also know we have a greater community interest that we need to balance with that enterprise model. So understanding that tackling a cost recovery or a financial sustainability model provides power. Knowledge is power. As a practitioner, as a park and recreation frontline person, a director, a mid-level management person, the knowledge that you have from a budget standpoint and from a financial standpoint is power. It's positioning. I'll go back to what Chris said too. While we're experiencing budget cuts, we know everyone's going to be experiencing budget cuts. The typical budget cut right now reported by the NRPA is above 20%. We know that that's preliminary. That's going to be much greater than that. Someone out there, the leadership within your organization, municipal or county organization, or whatever you work under, is either going to dictate that to you, or you're going to be able to have the tools in an orchestra to orchestrate what that allocation of funding looks like from the budget cut standpoint. And that's where we get to this idea of equity. And some of the questions that we get asked is, how do we do this equitably? Well, equity is the backdrop and the most beautiful part of cost recovery and sustainability modeling. And it allows you to articulate why something is incredibly important to a community, so that we don't then respond to the whims of a few rather than the needs of many.
Mm-hmm. To just take from what Lisa was saying and talking about this idea of, having the conversation around like that articulating the value of what it is that needs to be broken down, revisited, relooked at, and just frankly given a good hard cold look at. To me, that doesn't sound like something that's necessary in a crisis. But Jamie, I think you said it earlier, there's kind of an urgency created around right now this need to have that level of transparency and accountability, because we're being told we have to do the work. So now that we're being told we have to do the work, we may be realizing, wow, it would have been great if I'd started this a little bit earlier, but hindsight's 2020, so everything, it is what it is, really, and we've just got to kind of deal with the reality we've got. So my question for you, Jamie, is if you were to talk to an agency right now about why it's good to do the exercise of cost recovery and resource allocation, I'd love to get an idea of not only, I think it's clear why it's so valuable during a crisis, but really tell me when things are good. So you talked a little bit about, our memory was short after the Great Recession. why is it valuable to do an exercise like cost recovery and resource allocation when times are good? What value will that bring to your organization? And could it have, brought organizations more stability and security now in a crisis that showed up kind of obviously out of nowhere?
I like to think about it very personally. If we were to think about this question and the whys or why nots, if we think about it in terms of our own lives for a moment, we know we have to pay the rent, or we've got to pay the mortgage, we have monthly utilities, we got a phone bill, we've got an internet bill. Likely today you have a Netflix bill and a Prime bill and all these other bills. We got to pay for food. And maybe if we can, which not very many people can, we want to put something away for, a rainy day when the roof leaks or it's got to be replaced. And when we take all that, we do the math and we tally that up and we see what the total is, we compare and contrast that with how much we bring in. And if we can't make ends meet, we have to come up with an alternative. And it's down to one or two things. We either make more money or we spend less. That's it at the end of the day. So we go through some type of cost recovery exercise every single day as individuals, but we don't always apply that in our work. And that's where I think, unfortunately, our field has some limited business acumen in some corners of the world. Essentially, I think we're in a place because our growth was unsustainable of a correction. We're either in a place where we're going to have to generate more revenues or spend less. That's our reality. And we go through a cost recovery exercise every single day as individuals, but not always in our work. And I think our profession has been somewhat efficient in terms of applying basic business acumen. So as public sector employees, I think we have to ask ourselves whether or not we exhibit financial discipline and whether or not we're responsible taxpayer dollars. And the basic foundations of cost recovery are simply to adopt a financial management philosophy that, contrary to public opinion, is not about making profit. It's about being thoughtful and responsible with financial resources. When things are presumably good, people are moving in, housing prices are going up, buildings taking place all around us. We can pay the bills and everything seems right in the world. And in these circumstances, we may not know what things cost, whether or not we can maintain the new facility we just built, or whether we have sufficient reserves. We just believe we don't need to entertain a cost recovery exercise. So then cost recovery work becomes something for others who are in financial straits. But frankly, there's no better time than when things are good for us to go through this exercise so we can remain stable and fiscally healthy. What I often see in organizations interested in cost recovery when they're feeling some levels of desperation is we need help. And if that's the case, there's no better time to embrace that kind of work or this kind of work. We've got, in most instances, uninformed constituents who often don't understand what things really cost. And unfortunately, I think many of these same people believe that simply by virtue of paying taxes, it affords them and entitles them a right to all government services. But we know that's simply not the case. And it definitely won't be the case moving forward. So for me, I see the crisis as presenting us this need to better understand our financial realities in order to prepare ourselves for the uncertainties ahead. And the reality is, if we can create some financial management practice and policy in organizations, whether it's in good times or bad, it's going to obviously help us feel, again, a little bit more control in these uncertain times.
Right. I love this. I think one of the really, I think, you likened it to personal finances, which I think is, again, kind of what keeps coming to mind when we're talking about this idea of we do it for our own personal, at least we should be having that reflection about our own personal finances, and we need to be applying them to our organizations as we go through it. And Chris, I just really quickly, I know you've got thoughts on this subject, so I wanted you to kind of share with us what you can. It can be really overwhelming on a good day when you think you've got good financial stability and things are going well to think about cost recovery and resource allocation, whether on a personal level and you need to see a financial advisor, or on a professional level and for your organization, just thinking about where to begin, how to do it. What would you say, if you could, are some of the main reasons why people would be reticent to jump into projects like this? And tell me how you would help us learn how to not be afraid and embrace a project like cost recovery and resource allocation to set us up for success.
Well, I think part of the issue is the word itself, or the term, the cost recovery. And people, I call it the cost recovery conundrum. We have been cost recovering for years in Parks and Recreation Finance, but we haven't been as intentional about it as we should. And so when you put the term out there, some people misunderstand it. They don't want to use it, or it's been misused in the past. So it's been maybe a little bit corrupted into what people think that is, and that's what makes them afraid of it. They don't, if they think it's promoting a pay-for-play philosophy, which is what we hear sometimes, they see that as potentially widening the divide between the haves and the have-nots, or it's just a way to replace tax dollars with fee-based funding. But in reality, it's a measurement. It's revenues divided by what it costs to provide a service. It's represented as a percentage, and it doesn't mean that you have to recover 100% all the time. It's based on a benefits model. So some agencies have had a previous bad experience in the name of cost recovery. And generally what I've seen that comes from is that the intent was either to just, they had to increase revenues to respond to some financial pressure, or they, just wanted to gain some kudos from increasing revenues, or lack of understanding the concept of who's benefiting from the service. The community or the individual who's partaking, or a lack of discipline and integrity in exploring those benefits, and instead allowing the approach to waft into which service is more important or which has the higher stature due to its ability to attract revenues. And neither of those is a good basis for a cost recovery philosophy. So what that's done is it's pitted employees against each other, caused agencies loss sometimes of important programs, and frankly, it's tipped the scales away from mission-based core programs to less essential offerings. And that just isn't what cost recovery studies are all about. As Jamie and Lisa both said, this is it's a business practice that is about accountability and transparency and responsibility with how we use those dollars. So some staff and policy board members believe that cost recovery means you need to recover all of the costs, and that's simply not true. How you count things makes a difference. So what you're counting is your cost, but if you're not counting things, it doesn't mean they don't exist. What you have to expend to get something to happen has to be counted somewhere. The last thing I'll mention, it's not really a fear, but it's that big undertaking that's, I think Lisa mentioned, about what it takes to really get these numbers together and understand, because our budget, governmental accounting systems do not allow us to easily track or analyze the expenditures by programs and services. Registration and point of sale systems are pretty good for neatly tracking our revenues, but the expenditure side just is this arduous manual process with lots of clarification and decisions needed along the way. And cost recovery software being developed, once these clarifications and decisions are in place, in addition to a picture in time analysis that you have that allows you to kind of reset with strong philosophy and operating principles in place, you can track the costs on a regular basis and use the data for ongoing performance metrics. So the ultimate goal of developing your cost recovery or resource allocation or revenue philosophy is to ensure the long-term sustainability of services in a way that's fair for your community. Targets are established for all types of services that you have according to a variety of considerations that are related to the mission of your organization. And it's a balance of how these programs and services benefit the community and benefit the individuals. So embracing this kind of undertaking provides a framework for community discussion. It's widely accepted by policymakers and the public, and it puts a great deal of information in your hands while providing a guide so you can set your pricing with confidence and knowing you have the support of your policymakers. In many cases, has eliminated policy boards needing or wanting to approve myriad fees from using much more than an emotional basis to do so. And that's what I would be afraid of, not the cost recovery process.
This episode of GP Red Presents is part of a GP Red special initiative called Operation Recreation Response, with a focus on helping agencies prepare for, respond to, and recover from disasters. If you are interested in becoming involved with ORR, please email info@gpred.org.